Chapter 2 is titled Biological Beginnings. In this lecture, we'll be discussing topics associated with conception, as well as genetic issues and reproductive issues, as well as the issues of nature versus nurture. So when we discuss genetics, we'll be talking about the foundations of genetics, or the basics of genetics. We'll be talking about genetic abnormalities, including chromosomal abnormalities. We'll also be discussing reproductive issues, as well as prenatal diagnostics, and then we'll also be discussing the issue of nature versus nurture. Research has established that genetics influence all dimensions of human development, whether it be physical, cognitive, or socio-emotional. We see that disease runs in families. We see that alcoholism runs in families, Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular issues, diabetes. So there seems to be a strong genetic component to all of these aspects of physical development. We see that intelligence also seems to be associated with genetics. Certainly when we look at extreme cases of individuals who have a genetic chromosomal abnormality that influences their cognitive functioning, that's very evident. But research also demonstrates that the more genetic similarity that two people share, the more similar their intelligences are. And then we also see that personality traits also tend to run in families as well, and there are certain genes that are associated with specific personality traits. It's important to note that genes interact with environmental experiences, nature and nurture, to shape our development. And so environmental experiences can be both positive and negative. So environmental stimulation can include social interaction as well as education. And then we also have negative environmental experiences, which we describe as stress, things like trauma, and negative social interactions or negative personal experiences, which vary greatly. With regard to genetic foundations, it's important to differentiate between chromosomes, DNA, and genes. So normal human cells contain 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46. These chromosomes contain our DNA, and our DNA contains our genes. So genes are segments of DNA that contain our hereditary information, everything from eye color to tendencies for personality and intelligence and disease. It's important to differentiate between chromosomes and genes because we'll be discussing chromosomal disorders as well as genetic disorders. Chromosomes are passed on via gametes. These are sperm cells and egg cells. So when we have 23 pairs of chromosomes in our cells, 23 of those chromosomes come from our father's sperm, and the other 23 chromosomes come from our mother's eggs. A zygote is an egg cell that has been fertilized by a sperm cell, so it's essentially conception that's taken place. It's important to be familiar with the term zygote because that'll help us better understand the terms monozygotic and dizygotic twins. As you see here, we have a graphic that displays the 23 pairs of chromosomes, the 23rd pair of chromosome determining the sex of the human being, with an XX pattern being indicative of female and an XY pattern being indicative of male. This is important to note because there's many chromosomal disorders that specifically affect this pair, the 23rd pair. When we discuss Down syndrome, we'll be discussing the 21st pair of chromosomes. So dizygotic twins are also referred to as fraternal twins. These are twins that share 50% genetic similarity because they are produced by two separate eggs being fertilized by two separate sperm. So they share 50% genetic similarity, much like any other pair of siblings. Actually, when I say any other pair of siblings, siblings that share the same father and the same mother, if two siblings, such as half-siblings, a half-brother or a half-sister, only share one parent, then they only share about 25% genetic similarity. Monozygotic twins, these are identical twins, and this results when a single fertilized egg is divided immediately after conception. These individuals begin with 100% genetic similarity, and they do ultimately end up becoming different people. And this is a very important resource to developmental psychologists because these individuals share 100% genetic similarity, so any differences that exist between them, whether they be differences in their physical, cognitive, or socio-emotional development, can absolutely be attributed to the environment. So if these individuals have different personalities or different levels of intelligence, or one ends up developing a certain physical ailment that the other one does not, we can definitely with confidence state that those differences are a result of environmental experiences and are not due to genetics. As we move on to chromosomal and genetic abnormalities, we'll begin with Down syndrome, which is the most common chromosomal disorder. It's also referred to as trisomy 21 because these individuals have an extra chromosome on the 21st pair of chromosomes. So their cells do not have 46 chromosomes, they have 47 chromosomes. This syndrome results in distinctive physical features such as an enlarged tongue and almond-shaped eyes. They typically have smaller hands, and this also results in mild to severe intellectual disability. So it's important to understand that individuals with Down syndrome, their symptoms are going to vary greatly. They're all unique individuals. Some of them have severe intellectual disability and some of them do not. Those that have higher levels of intellectual or cognitive functioning, we refer to those individuals as high functioning individuals. These individuals are more likely to be able to gain employment or go to college or finish their regular education. The most important thing to know from Down syndrome, not the most, but a very important thing to note about Down syndrome is that the incidence is correlated with maternal age. The graphic down here demonstrates that women at the age of 20, for every 2,000 births delivered of a woman who's the age of 20, there will only be one case of Down syndrome. However, when we look at a woman who's 40 years of age, for every 100 births of a woman who's aged 40, one of those children is likely to be born with Down syndrome. So it's important to note that even at the age of 40, there's still a 99% chance that the child will not have Down syndrome. But when we look at a general human population of 8 billion people, there are many women who are age 40 years of age, who are giving birth, and so one in every one of those 100 births will result in Down syndrome. We typically refer to the maternal age of 35 as kind of a high risk pregnancy. So as you can see, it becomes increasingly higher risk of having a child with Down syndrome as a woman gets older. And women do give birth to children at the age of 45 and 48, certainly not as common as 25 or 28. And one of the reasons is because of the fact that they understand that, hopefully, that they understand that the older they get, there's a higher chance of having a child with a chromosomal disorder. Fragile X syndrome is another chromosomal abnormality. It does not affect the number of chromosomes, rather it affects a particular X chromosome, and it doesn't allow the chromosome to essentially seal or enclose itself, and so therefore it results in intellectual disabilities and autism. It affects males at a much higher rate than females, and as you can see, the statistics are provided for you there. These syndromes, Klinefelter syndrome, XYY syndrome, and Turner syndrome, all of these affect the 23rd pair of chromosomes that determines our sex. With regard to Klinefelter syndrome, these are males who are born with an extra X sex chromosome. So these individuals do have 47 chromosomes as well. And this results in a wide range of distinctive physical features, including smaller testicles and enlarged breasts and above average height. You'll notice that it affects about 1 in 600 males, and it's usually not diagnosed until after puberty. So this syndrome is interesting in that it really only targets or affects physical development. It doesn't have very much effect on cognitive development. But when physical development is affected with these kinds of features, this individual may experience issues with self-esteem, and so of course that's likely to have an influence on their socio-emotional development. With regard to XYY syndrome, these are males with an extra Y sex chromosome, so they have an XYY pattern on their 23rd pair. Again, it's mostly closely associated with physical features such as above average height and acne. XYY syndrome is very interesting in that it was once falsely linked to increased aggression. There was a time when the science basically indicated or suggested that these individuals were more aggressive than the average human being, which eventually was proven to be false. And then we have Turner syndrome, which affects females. These are females that lack a second X chromosome. These individuals, again, it mostly affects their physical features and not really their cognitive features. These women are typically shorter than average. They're typically infertile and are more likely to have a webbed neck. A webbed neck basically means a very, very short or lack of a chin. Phenylketonuria is a genetic abnormality. So these individuals lack the ability to metabolize a specific amino acid known as phenylalanine. It's found in most proteins, and what ends up happening is that excessive consumption of this amino acid leads to brain damage. Thankfully, we're able to identify this disorder very early on in life to prevent any excessive brain damage. There are certain products out there like Diet Coke that will contain a statement that says contains phenylalanine, and that's basically there to warn people that may have PKU. So we also have sickle cell anemia to discuss. It's a genetic abnormality that primarily affects African Americans. It affects about 10% of African Americans are genetic carriers. This disease is basically results in distorted red blood cells. That's why it's referred to as sickle cell. These blood cells take on a distorted kind of sickle shaped, and this impedes blood flow and restricts blood flows, particularly to extremities like arms and legs, and it can result in pain and discomfort, which can of course affect mobility and maybe even things like job performance. And then we also have Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs disease is an extreme genetic abnormality that results in extreme deceleration of mental and physical development during early childhood. It's more common in Eastern European genes as well as Jewish ancestry. These children typically have normal development and are reaching the regular milestones throughout the first year of life, but then they start to lose these milestones and their development begins to regress, and their nervous system essentially begins to deteriorate and ultimately results in death at around the age of 4 or 5. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic abnormality that is a respiratory issue. It basically results in lots of mucus buildup. There are certain treatments that are available for that are indicated in the video provided. It results in a shortened lifespan as well as respiratory issues. The average lifespan of someone with cystic fibrosis is somewhere around 45, whereas individuals without cystic fibrosis, when you take that out of the equation, the average lifespan of humans is about 75 to 80. Spina bifida is a birth defect in which the neural tube fails to seal. This can be prevented with folic acid. So when we look at disorders or abnormalities like spina bifida, cystic fibrosis, and Tay-Sachs disease, one of the things to keep in mind is that these genetic abnormalities result in a worsened quality of life. So when we talk about individuals having to receive regular treatment, or individuals having a shortened lifespan, or individuals not being able to engage in the activities that they would otherwise be able to if they didn't have these diseases or abnormalities, we refer to that as poor quality of life. So with spina bifida, when the neural tube fails to seal, that essentially sucks the brain down into the spinal cavity, specifically the cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain, and the cerebellum is responsible for motor coordination and balance. And so therefore these individuals primarily are going to have issues with movement and body control. But it can also result in other impairments that are cognitively related. Diabetes, this is probably something that many people have heard about. It's important to understand that there's a genetic link to diabetes. It's not completely determined by our environmental experiences. There's two types. We have type 1, which is strictly inherited, also called juvenile diabetes, and then we have type 2, which does have a genetic component to it, but really results more so from lifestyle, so there's a much stronger environmental influence to it. Hemophiliacs are individuals that do not have the ability to form blood clots as easily as people without it. And so when we experience a cut and we begin to bleed, our body has a natural ability to form a blood clot, so that way the bleeding can stop and heal itself. People who have hemophilia, they lack this ability, and so therefore cuts can be very life-threatening for them. Huntington's disease is also a neurodegenerative disease, much like Tay-Sachs disease. What's different about Huntington's disease is that these individuals typically do not experience any symptoms until about the age of 35. These individuals may lead a happy and normal lifestyle. They may be educated and employed and have a family, but then around the age of 35, their mid-30s to early 40s, they may begin to lose the ability to function. They may lose the ability to walk and the ability to talk, and so many of them end up in assisted living facilities. Huntington's disease has a strong genetic component to it, and so individuals that develop Huntington's disease but have already lived to the age of 35 or 40 and have maybe already had several children, it's quite likely that one of those children are likely to develop Huntington's disease as well. Regarding reproductive issues, we'll be discussing prenatal diagnostic tests, the issue of infertility and reproductive technology, and briefly we'll be discussing the topic of adoption. So prenatal diagnostics include maternal blood screening, ultrasound sonography, fetal MRI, chorionic villus sampling, and amniocentesis. Maternal blood screening is what we refer to as a non-invasive procedure. We're essentially just drawing some blood from the woman, and we'll be able to use the blood to also determine whether or not there's any genetic or chromosomal abnormalities that are present within the baby. Ultrasounds are very common, also non-invasive. We basically use sound waves to produce a black and white image of the baby, and that allows us to also determine the sex of the baby without any sort of other invasive procedures. Fetal MRIs are a more advanced graphic imaging technique. This is typically reserved for high-risk pregnancies, and maybe if a pregnant woman is involved in a car accident, and we need to get a more detailed image to make sure that everything is going as planned with a pregnancy. Chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis, these are referred to as invasive prenatal diagnostics. With chorionic villus sampling, we essentially penetrate the woman's vagina to receive a tissue sample, and we use that tissue sample to determine if the baby has any sort of genetic or chromosomal abnormalities. Amniocentesis, another invasive procedure, involves puncturing the abdomen with a needle and also puncturing the amniotic sac to retrieve some amniotic fluid and using that fluid to perform prenatal diagnostics. In vitro fertilization is a process in which eggs and sperm are combined in a laboratory dish. This is used when maybe a male has had a vasectomy and is unable to produce sperm regularly, or maybe when a woman is interested in becoming pregnant through the use of a sperm donor. So the eggs, or if a couple is just having difficulty conceiving it in a traditional way, so we get eggs and sperm samples from the individuals and we combine them in a laboratory dish, in a petri dish, so that way fertilization can take place there. After a few days, once the zygote has become an embryonic culture, we're able to transfer those embryos into the woman's uterus, and ideally they will attach to the woman's uterus, and the woman will go on to have a very successful pregnancy. Sometimes we insert more than one embryo, and that can often result in twins. So in vitro fertilization has a higher rate of twins than traditional pregnancies. Adoption is a very interesting concept because the idea of adoption is that we are becoming parents to someone we have no genetic similarity to. We have nothing in common, although that's not always the case. For the most part, when we think about adoption, we're talking about people adopting essentially someone whose genes we have nothing in common with. So although we won't be able to share any sort of genetic similarities, the younger that the child is when they're adopted, the more environmental experiences we're likely to share with the individual, and the more environmental influence we can impose on the individual as well. It's very challenging for children to get adopted as they get older, when they're 14 or 15 years of age, because at that point they've already had so many environmental experiences that have shaped their personality, and so it makes it more difficult for the adopting parents to have an impact on the individual's development of their personality as well as their cognition as well. The earlier the influences on an individual, the more lasting of an impact they're going to have, is what the science shows. There's many different ways that people can adopt. They can adopt through the public welfare system. This is a very expensive and legally complicated matter. Adoption can also occur through a private agency or through international adoption. You see some statistics there of the amount of children that are in foster care by year. So basically and as you can see, it basically increases every single year. So pretty much now that it's 2020, it's safe to assume that there's about 500,000 children in foster care who are seeking to be adopted. Children are given up for adoption on a regular basis due to a wide range of issues, but it is certainly something that is relevant to lifespan growth and development. So chapter 2 is a very brief chapter, and that concludes this lecture. Be sure to download this PowerPoint and watch all of the videos that are provided so that way you can get a better understanding of the topics that we discussed.